Good evening. I'm Henry Neufeld. I'm the owner of Energeon Publications and editor. And tonight I'm planning to start a Bible study on the Gospel according to John. This is kind of a personal project of mine. It is not some kind of an official publication. It's not a course of study. I'm not going to have a syllabus. It's not going to be a series of lectures. I did consider, as I've done in the past with various materials, just recording this for my YouTube channel and then posting. But then I decided to make it possible for people to interact through Google Hangouts on air. So what I'm going to do first here, before we even get started on the subject matter, is show you a couple of well, provided that this will do what I need it to do. There we go. A few web addresses that you can use. First of all, I've activated the Q&A app on Google Hangouts. That app may, some people have had some difficulty locating it. If you can't locate it, it's also possible if you go on to Twitter, just tweet at @HNeufeld, what I'm showing here on this list. And I am monitoring my Twitter account as I work here. And then for follow-up and comments during the week, my Google Plus account there is just plus Henry Neufeld, and my blog is Threads from Henry's Web, henrysthreads.com. I'll leave that for just a couple of minutes as I get started. Tonight is a night of introductions, and I think it may be in many ways a little more boring than the rest. It's kind of the nature of introductions. There's introductions in two different senses going on here. First, of course, we're introducing the study that I'm about to do on the Gospel of John. Second, we're introducing me to you. If you haven't watched any of my YouTube videos before or read any of my books. And third, we're going to talk introduction to the Gospel of John. Now, one of the reasons that I just presented my blog is I do intend to put things like references there during the week. And I also intend to respond to comments if I do have them there. I'd like to see some interaction involved in this due to the fact that we're doing it as a hangout, and we have so many different ways of responding. I don't regard myself as an expert on the Gospel of John. I was launched into this study for my own benefit and then decided to share. My own studies emphasized the Old Testament a great deal more than the New, although I did study some amount at the undergraduate level on the New Testament. So I'm probably a little more confident in some of the Old Testament books. But one of the things that I've found is that, you know, I know many people often list very famous people as their influences, but the influences that I would tend to list are a lot less famous. For example, I do use a lot of vocabulary, as I think probably most people who discuss theology will from time to time, from Paul Tillich. But I wouldn't know that vocabulary if I hadn't been introduced by a professor named Gerald Winslow at Walla Walla University when I was an undergraduate student. And I'm very, very interested in the inspiration of Scripture in biblical criticism, all the way from textual criticism to some of the so-called forms of higher criticism, form criticism, redaction criticism, and source criticism, as well as some of the more modern ones. So I'm extremely interested in those, but I would not have gotten that interest, I think, unless, again, another of my undergraduate professors named Alden Thompson had shown me a textual variant in the class and said, okay, how does that impact your understanding of this text? How does that impact the way your understanding of the way the text was preserved? And a lot of study resulted from that. My launch into this particular study was influenced by one of the authors for my company, for Energion Publications, and his name is Herold Weiss. Herold Weiss is, well, as a matter of fact, he taught a couple of the professors that I studied under when they were in graduate school. Now, he's not trying to make him sound incredibly old. The ages are a little bit closer than you might think based on that. And we're all still alive and kicking. But Herold Weiss has written a number of books, and I'm just going to hold one up here that got it started. He wrote a book called Finding My Way in Christianity. This book goes geographically from South America to Europe and the Middle East and the United States in his experiences. And it talks about how the discoveries that he made challenged his faith and how he responded to that. This was a very good introduction. I had not actually studied under him or read anything when he submitted this manuscript for publication. He's followed that up with another book titled Creation in Scripture. This looks all the way through the Bible at many of the nuances that you'll find in Scripture, and he's going to be part of a panel on our Energion hangout on January the 20th. But then he submitted a manuscript titled Meditations on According to John. According to John is taken from the title that the Gospel of John has in the Greek manuscripts in general. As a matter of fact, I believe the earliest manuscripts we have that include the beginning of the book already have that header on the manuscript. And so that's how he chose to title this book. The subtitle is Exercises in Biblical Theology. Now, combining that title and subtitle really had me hooked, because this is looking at the scriptures asking, what does this tell me about God? How does this help my understanding of God? And also, how does it help me understand the mission, the ministry of Jesus, and the community that rose up around that ministry? What Dr. Weiss had noticed was that the Gospel of John is very difficult to read in pieces. It is so interconnected. The vocabulary carries between the various passages, and he wondered how he could present this. And so what he did was a series of meditations that apply theologically these themes. In other words, he takes a theme, starts from a text, but then he looks at the theme throughout the book. In editing this, I was absolutely hooked. Some of the thinking that this provoked was just a tremendous boost for me on a spiritual basis. And I decided, when I'm done with this book, when I'm done thinking about it so technically, where I'm looking for the use of commas, making sure that the spelling is all correct and the footnotes are all correct, when I was done with that, I was going to go back and study the book for myself. I'd already determined that before I decided that I'd go ahead and do these video presentations. Now, from my point of view, whether I ever have any viewers or not, it doesn't really matter. Kind of the discipline of saying, I'm going to study a chapter of this book every week is what I'm looking for. I really do want to share with you, because studying this particular book has impacted me so profoundly. And so it's thanks to Dr. Weiss, and I'm not going to hold up his book because I'm using it in ebook form. It's available in ebook for Adobe Digital Editions, for Kindle, and also in print, of course. And that title is Meditations on According to John. Now, as we're going through introduction, you probably already noticed covering the introduction gets, you cover a lot of ground. And you also, you probably get into some nitty-gritty details, and it may seem a little bit boring compared to, let's jump into John 1, and the Word became flesh and came to live among us. And that's really, so we're going to be jumping into the beginning of the gospel, and that's some really powerful stuff. But first, we need to get an idea of where we're going, and that's the purpose of introduction. One of my professors, again at Walla Walla, when we were discussing some changes that were being made to the curriculum, this was in fact after I graduated, told me, he said, introduction is wasted on beginners. And we were talking in particular about how you go to college, say, to do a degree in biblical studies, and you start with an introduction to the New Testament, introduction to the Old Testament, and then you study the individual books. Well, these introductions are there to answer a lot of questions that are likely to come up as you work through the material. But almost by definition, if you're at the introduction level, you really don't have those questions yet. And you also don't entirely know how you're going to answer them. And so I'm going to, as I go through this, first today, as I talk about the introduction, and then as we go through the individual studies, I'm going to spend some time on how do we get from the text of John and from the historical information that we know that comes up around it to the various conclusions. Not just coming to conclusions, not just saying, here, as I was meditating this week, here it is, but rather saying, how do we get there? So when you start talking about an introduction to a Bible book, it does have some similarities to introduction to a person, but there are key elements that you have. One of the things we ask is, when was the book written? Who wrote the book? What are the major themes? How might you outline the contents of the book? And all of those elements that you go through in an introduction to a book are things that can also help set the how you're going to answer the questions. So when you read, if you're starting to study a book of the Bible, and when you read introductions, be sure that you think a little bit about why the author of the introduction came to that conclusion. As a matter of fact, I recommend that if you're studying a new book of scripture with which you are not very familiar, read more than one introduction, read introductions from more than one perspective. And I'm going to demonstrate a little bit about that. I talked a little bit here about how we're talking about biblical criticism. A lot of the answers to this are things that come either through the use of various tools of Bible study, including, in my opinion, those of biblical criticism. I'm going to quote here from page 12 of Dr. Weiss's book then. It says, one of the purposes of this book of meditations is to demonstrate that it is quite possible to take seriously the results of modern critical study of the ancient texts and be a modern believer in the one sent by the Father. Now, in some of my discussions of the Gospel of John leading up to this, I've dealt with issues of historicity. And I'm going to give you a quick overview of my own approach. I both tend to take the history relatively seriously for myself, but at the same time, I don't feel it's as critical an issue as many people do. I'm going to take what Dr. Weiss here says both ways. A lot of what he teaches about the book is going to be quite valid whether or not you accept all of the introductory views that he takes. You can disagree with him, and very often in other books, you can disagree with the author on the on what they say specifically about authorship or even date. or some of the themes of the book, and still find a great deal of value. I'm going to demonstrate that in just a few minutes with a couple of quotations regarding the Gospel of John. So the real question I think that I've been asked most often is, how do people come to the conclusions that they have when they're introducing a book? And I'm going, the introduction to a gospel such as this comes from looking at two different varieties of evidence. Let's consider a modern book. Say you have a book of historical fiction that, let's set it in World War II. The way we look at the book is we look specifically at, generally these days, at external evidence. We look at the cover. It says a historical novel. We know then that it's a historical novel. Then we look inside and we judge it accordingly. We ask, is it accurate in terms of how it fits with the historical facts, even though the particular characters are fictitious? But now imagine for a moment that the cover and the title page and all of the introductory material is ripped off of the book. How are you going to tell what this is? Well, what you do then is you're going to be able to read what's in the book and see what it is in form. And a historical novel reads differently, both from other varieties of novel, or from an academic work of history. They read very differently, but they might read somewhat similarly to, say, a historical memoir where somebody is telling their particular experiences in the war. And a historical memoir can have varying relationships to the truth. So you're going to be looking then at what's written inside. What does it refer to answer your questions as to when it was written? So if we take this up with the Gospel of John, you're going to have authors of introductions looking at these two kinds of evidence, and how they balance them, how they read the evidence is going to make a great deal of difference. Now I'm going to start out, I'm going to be reading introductions from two people, and I need to emphasize at the start that both of these authors are people that I publish. They are scholars that I respect, and they are both friends. But you're going to see some very significant differences in what I read. Starting with Dr. Weiss, I'm just going to grab a few things. He talks a little bit about the discussion that there are various sources in the Gospel of John. And he says the problem with all these reconstructions of the origin of the gospel text in our possession, however, is that they lack a foundation that is based on broad appeals to vocabulary, style, or theological perspectives. And then he says, against all source theories, it must be noted the text displays amazing stylistic, verbal, and theological integrity. But then on the other hand, and that's, I quote a little further on, lacking sufficient supporting evidence, these various source theories have not been widely adopted. Still, many recognize that there may have been a collection of miracle stories which supplied material to the gospel. And he points out some things that look like possibly seams. For example, there appears to be a first and a second sign. He believes that the second sign, however, should have been at the cleansing of the temple. And so the numbering of the signs takes a look. On page 10, some narrative sequences now appear to be dislodged, so that chapter 7, 15 through 24 clearly belongs together with the story of the healing of the paralytic at Bethesda. That's chapter 5, 1 through 16. Now, how do you respond yourself to something like that? Well, one thing that I'd like to invite anybody to do who's reading an introduction is pull out your New Testament, and read chapter 5, 1 through 16, and then continue on by reading chapter 7, 15. And consider, do you think that this sounds like this is supposed to be together? And different people come to different conclusions about that. That's why, we provide the specifics of the evidence. So now let's get to the conclusion. These many perplexing difficulties may be taken to indicate that the gospel developed over a period of time with sections added into an existing text as circumstances changed. And then he goes on to indicate that nearly everyone agrees that it was written 95 CE or following. And that date is actually non-controversial because the vast majority of scholars hold to a date somewhere in that range now. Although there are a few that argue for earlier, and there are a few that would still argue for later. How do you come to that particular conclusion? Well, that's one of those interesting things. I'm not going to open another book. This is also one that I publish. It's Dr. David Allen Black. He wrote the book, Why Four Gospels? And I'm on page 71 where he talks about the same subject. Now, our conclusions are different, but please look a little bit more at the why. What is Dr. Black talking about that Dr. Weiss doesn't? It says the Gospel of John was composed in the last decade of the first century, or more precisely 96 or one of the succeeding years. And then he goes and cites a number of elements of internal evidence, such as there's the gospel itself implies that its author, which Dr. Black has already argued was the Apostle John, is advanced in years, and that Peter has already died. So now let me skip down a little bit more here. He says, the Monarchian prologue to the fourth gospel, probably written about 200 or a little later, says concerning the date of the appearance of the gospel, he, that's the Apostle John, wrote this gospel in the province of Asia after he had composed the Apocalypse on the island of Patmos. The banishment of John to Patmos occurred in the last year of Domitian's reign, around 95. A few months before his death on September 1896, the emperor had discontinued the persecution of the Christians and recalled the exile. That's citing Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History 3.20 and 5 through 7. This evidence indicates that the gospel was composed in 96 or one of the years immediately following. Okay, we're coming to a different conclusion on authorship, the same conclusion on date, but the important thing that I want you to notice is Dr. Black cites very heavily the internal evidence, and Dr. Weiss, the external evidence, and Dr. Weiss cites very heavily the internal evidence. So you have these two views. Now, I'm going to bore everybody to death and probably run over time if I were to try to deal with all of that and argue all of that out right now. One of the reasons I'm reading both of those is to suggest that you do read more than one source. Then you get all of this evidence. But you do have to consider, a lot of us now in the 20th century, what we think of primarily when we think of evidence for the date of a book, for who wrote it and so on, is what would be called in studying an ancient document the external evidence. And you have to ask, okay, just how reliable is the external evidence? I'm reminded of receiving a shipment from my printer once, and I look at the box and I have the order number and I know what's in that order number. I open the box and there's a packing slip, and the packing slip lists the things that I expect to find. However, when I opened the first book, it had the cover of the book that I had ordered, but it had the contents of another one. Wasn't even the same subject, if I remember right. I had a book that was a series of stories, and the actual content here was a cookbook. Was not at all related to the interior content. And the rest of the books in the box were not the same book as what I'd ordered again. Now, my printer is very nice and sent me replacements cheerfully for the box of books. But the point that I'm making here is that your external evidence is not always correct. Just because somebody says something happened doesn't mean that that's the way it actually happened. So as you both kinds of evidence have to be evaluated. The external evidence, ask yourself how reliable the person is, but also how likely it is that they're going to be able to know the information that they're telling you. Are they repeating a story that they heard from somebody else? Is this firsthand? Just how exactly does it work? And I think that as we go through the book, we're going to look at, especially, we're probably going to spend more time talking about internal evidence because we're going to be reading the gospel, and we'll especially be asking the question, how do these things fit? Because this book is so well tied together. It's interesting that, well, you know, Dr. Weiss talks about it being pulled together. He comes to the same conclusion that the person who finally tied the bow on the Gospel of John did a really wonderful job. And so then on the other hand, you're going to read from Dr. Black, well, this wonderful job of tying it together says single author, careful planning, and careful authorship. And so those are the kinds of things that we'll have an opportunity to look at as we go through the book. Now, when you're dealing with an ancient text, you have some additional issues to deal with. Let's talk just a little bit about what evidences are used for dating. In the Gospel of John, we cited some there from reading Dr. Black's book, Why Four Gospels, but I did not read all of what he cites, nor did I read all of what Dr. Weiss cites as far as dealing with the date of the gospel. One of the key elements in modern dating for the Gospel of John is a papyrus called the Rylands Papyrus. It's numbered P52, and it is normally dated to the year 125. How did they date the papyrus? Well, that's a science we call paleography. Paleography is simply the study of old writing. You look at how writing develops, just like language develops over time, and so that you could tell something about when a document comes from by the kind of language that it uses. Also in ancient times when manuscripts were copied by scribes, when you did not have printing, you find that there is a development in the way characters were written. Now, paleography is a very, very painstaking science. You compare various letters, and what do you have to do? You have to find other documents that are reliably dated and then compare the one that you're trying to date to them. One of the arguments that I've read over the years, and I read another article recently, I have forgotten the reference. I'll try to post the reference to this article on my blog during the coming week. But it argues that this papyrus may have been wrongly dated, and they argue that it could come somewhat later than it does. Now, what did this papyrus do to the dating? Early in the 20th century and sometime before that, many scholars had dated the Gospel of John to somewhere in the middle of the 2nd century. So you'd be talking about 50 or more years after we're dating it. And you'll remember that both of the authors that I cited, using different approaches, came up to approximately the same range of dates for the Gospel. But some people had dated it substantially later. When this papyrus was discovered, which contains only a small fragment of the gospel, but from John 18, but that's enough, because it says, obviously the gospel must have been written before it can be copied. has to be copied before it can be distributed. So you ask the question, how likely are we even to have the first copy of the Gospel of John? So you have to assume that there's probably some period of time of distribution before this particular papyrus came into existence. So that says something. It doesn't give us a precise date. Some paleographers will talk about plus or minus 25 years. Some will talk about larger numbers than that. I really have a hard time myself with dating that is more precise than plus or minus 50, and I'm probably a little bit skeptical even there, especially when we're dealing with a period of time when there are very few examples of contemporary writing that we can date absolutely. But you have to remember that that argument really cuts both ways. Yes, it could be later, but it could also be earlier than 125. There's nothing to prevent it from actually being earlier. The article that I'm going to, I'll put the citation on my blog, argued that it is most probably, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 or 50 years, if I remember correctly, later. That would still make a date for the Gospel of John in the middle of the 2nd century very difficult. But it illustrates the difficulty with some of this kind of dating. Another way, and we mentioned this when I used my contemporary example of trying to date our coverless historical novel, another way that you accomplish this same kind of goal is historical references in the text. And it's interesting to hear people argue with this. One of the problems with internal evidence is that it is very often imprecise. You don't get precise answers from internal evidence in many, many cases. So, for example, one of the arguments about the Gospel of John is that it doesn't talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, here's the two ways that this can be argued. There is an argument for a very early dating of John, that is before 70 AD or CE. And what happened in 70? Jerusalem was destroyed. You have the Jewish War from 67 forward, and in 70, Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans. So this is done two ways. First, it must have been long enough after the destruction of Jerusalem that it was not felt important to mention it. So if you're talking a date in 95 or 96 or later, that says we're 25 plus years after the destruction of Jerusalem. Another way, though, that is argued by the minority who are arguing for a very early date is the reason the destruction of Jerusalem isn't mentioned is that the book was written before Jerusalem was destroyed. And that's how you can see those arguments sometimes cut more than one way. Now, the majority of scholars hold to the later date, and it's well nigh universal to hold the date around 96 or later. I picked up a stack of my study Bibles that I keep on my shelf in order to compare different viewpoints, and all of them, without exception, from a variety from very conservative to practically secular introductory material, argued for approximately that date. Where the great difference is in arguing about the author. Did the Apostle John write the book? Is John the author of the book that now pretty much universally bears his name? And that is a much more difficult question to answer. If you, what I read from Dr. Black is largely was discussing the date because that's where I wanted to see all of the external evidence, but this cited. But much of the same evidence that he's citing for the date also applies, and incidentally is used in his book to argue that the Apostle John is in fact the writer. You have a fairly substantial early Christian tradition, starting from not that long after the apparent date of the gospel, saying that the Apostle John was the writer. So how does internal evidence work when you're studying the author of a book? Well, if I can turn to another portion of the New Testament, let's consider the epistles of Paul, or in a few cases, the disputed epistles. How does one determine if an epistle was written by Paul? Well, you say one of the things is to look at the name Paul at the beginning of it. Of course, that doesn't apply to Hebrews, which again, as a minority would argue, is actually written by Paul. But even many scholars argue that a number of the epistles that say that they were written by Paul were in fact written by a disciple in the generation after. So how is this going to be argued? Well, you're going to look at the style of writing. You're going to look at the vocabulary. You're going to look at the theology. You're going to look at the historical references, the people that are referenced. Let's say, for example, the fact that Timothy is referenced in Hebrews and in other places suggests, and Timothy is an associate of Paul, makes that one connection. And in the case of the epistles, we have a fairly substantial number that everyone agrees were written by the apostle. So then we take the things that we accept that he did write, and then we debate the ones that are we debate the ones that are in question, and we do this by comparison. Now, the problem with this approach is very simply that even with the epistles of Paul, we don't have a huge amount of writing. Let me just illustrate from my own life. I will write about the scripture. I will write about our topic today on my blog, Threads from Henry's Web, and that's going to have one style. I also have a blog for what I call my tent making work, which is computer services, computer support, network support. And I also do some custom programming. When I write on the blog for my business, I may sound pretty much like another person. My vocabulary will be substantially different. For example, my posts on technology are always shorter than my posts on theology. That has both to do with the subject and with my approach and with the people that I'm trying to talk to. So unless you have a very broad range of materials, it's very hard to answer the question of authorship. Now, if we turn back to the Gospel according to John and ask this question, everything that we have is in dispute in some way. And I'm talking again here from the internal evidence. You do not have external evidence suggesting that John, from the first 3 or 4 centuries, suggesting that John was written by anyone else. Revelation is considered much more controversial, but there's always the question: John, the 3 epistles of John, and the book of Revelation. Book of Revelation is its own interesting study, and you can ask the question, is this written by the same person who wrote the gospel and the epistles, especially the first epistle? And there's a number of debates in there. So we won't really be able to say, is John's vocabulary like something that we know was written by the Apostle John? Instead, we're simply asking, is there internal evidence to suggest that we should not accept the external evidence? Now, one of the key points that comes up here is, are we going to take more or less shall we say, what's called a conservative position? And I really dislike that, using that term in this case, and say, because we're wanting to talk about the gospel having spiritual authority, because we're looking at the authority of the Gospel of John as scripture, let's maintain the apostolic authorship. Now, the authors that I've cited are not making that argument. They may be bringing out of their argument the idea that we should consider the gospel authoritative. And in fact, both of the authors that I cited today are believers. But what what we need to be looking at here, first let me go, I got off track there a little bit. What we need to look at here is the suggestion that the gospel was not written or not all written by the Apostle John, necessarily saying that it's, that it is not authoritative. Personally, I think that both of these issues of history, is it historical? Is it authoritative? I don't think that those are necessarily one and the same question. This is something that I'd like to discuss as we go through the book. As I said, I'm going to be tending to talk a great deal about the things that happen in the Gospel of John, including miracles. I believe in miracles. That this material is historical. I don't consider that, like I said, critical. But I don't think that affirming that John is the author means that John was trying to write history in the sense that we have it. And I'm going to read another little bit here as soon as I can scroll to it in my ebook. I will tell you what, it is very easy to scroll to things in ebooks, but I personally have not gotten used to doing it quickly. So as a person who sells both print books and ebooks, I have to say that I'm still a little bit inclined to the print book. I find them easier to use. I'm going to read now, this is again from the introduction. I'm going to read starting on page 5. He says, the Christians who produced this gospel were an enclosed community distinct from the main currents of the early Christian movement. Their jargon, he's referring to the vocabulary that is consistent through the book, resonated clearly among them. To read according to John requires being aware that, as Louis J. Martin explained brilliantly some 40 years ago, it contains simultaneously two stories. Obviously, we are reading about the life of Jesus, but at the same time, we are reading about the experience of a community of Christians. Now, to some people, that sounds a little bit startling because you say, well, I'm reading the story of Jesus. What does that mean? What does it mean to say that we're reading two stories at the same time? But I want to suggest here that any time that we are telling the story of Jesus, we are telling at least two stories. Anytime that we're talking about a book, we're telling at least two stories. We're talking about the story that is contained in the text, but we're also talking about our own story. We as the reader come to the story and we're impacted by the story, and the way that it impacts us impacts the way that we're going to teach it. And I think that that's important to remember. One of the reasons it's important to remember is because very often we get into arguments that really don't have anything to do with the reasons why we disagree. Let's go back again. I'm using heavily this contrast between Dr. Black's and Dr. Weiss's way of discussing the dating and the authorship of John. I would love to hear a discussion between the two of them on this kind of a topic. I think it would be very interesting to hear them discuss it, but I'm not really that interested in hearing them directly debate the dating and the authorship of the gospel. Why is that? Because what the real interesting story is, why do you approach the issue the way that you do? And The difference there is entirely going to come down to how we weight the various pieces of evidence. What weight do we give to certain elements? Yes, there will be debates about what certain elements mean. Do you accept some of the disjunctions that Dr. Weiss talks about? Do you think that all of those early church authorities, including Eusebius, are authoritative and reliable? Those are good questions. But the debate would be, how do we approach the text? How do we come to understand this? And so when we don't understand how it is that we come to the conclusion, very often we end up arguing about something that is very different from what we should be, and such arguments tend simply to get tangled and never to get solved. So as I look at that, and I remind you of the passage that I read from Dr. Weiss, where he said he wants to demonstrate through this series of studies, one of the things he wants to demonstrate is that one can accept some of the conclusions of modern critical studies and still be a believer in the one sent by God. And so that is one of the things that I want us to be considering as we go through. So I will be mentioning some of the critical ways in which people have studied this material, some of those conclusions, and asking the question, of course, first of all, how much difference does this make? Then secondly, do we find those particular conclusions serious? I was having a discussion with another friend today, and probably end up citing some more sources there a little bit later, but he commented as to how one of his professors, who happens also to have been one of mine, had said, you can read the results of biblical criticism, but you don't have to accept all of it. You can be critical about the critics. So you can study the critics critically as well. And my friend mentioned that was a kind of a liberating position for him to take, because suddenly he realized that this is not about, choosing sides. It's about studying the material and coming to your conclusions. Now, most of what we'll be doing is not trying to study the material and come to this kind of technical conclusion that I'm talking about here, because this is probably the most technical presentation that I'm going to make as I go through John. What we're really going to be asking, the questions we're really going to be asking is, what does this gospel tell us about God? In other words, it's that theological, biblical theology. Biblical theology is the study of God founded in and driven by Bible study. So that's what we're actually going to be doing. But at the same time, we're going to be asking, how does our approach to Scripture impact what we're doing? And so let me just reflect on a couple of those points before I close. I will tell you that I'm making a hard limit of an hour. If I get to the hour, I'm going to bring it to a conclusion. If I finish before the hour, I'm going to conclude before the hour. If I have questions, I'll try to take care of those, especially before I close out. Today, I haven't received any questions, probably because I'm just plain talking too fast, or perhaps boring a few people to death. And I'll try to avoid doing that in the future as we're talking about the impact of the theology, some of these theological themes. But what I want us to do is look at how we're going to find this out. Let me make just a few suggestions here. Our first topic, coming from the first chapter of Dr. Weiss's book, is going to have to do with the Word made flesh. And again, I'm having fun flipping the not pages of my ebook. In the beginning was the Logos. In the beginning was the Word. And that comes from that first passage the first chapter of John, especially the first 18 verses, but that forms some imagery and a foundation that occurs many times through the book. That the Word became flesh. So we're going to be looking at that material. If you don't have the book, please read at least the first 18 verses of the first chapter of John. But let me recommend something else if you want to benefit from studying this book with me the most. What I have to say, and this is probably the wrong thing for somebody who's starting a series to say, what I have to say is really not all that important. What's important is you getting in touch with God through the Word. You getting in touch with God through this writing, you hearing. I'm also working on my study guide to Hebrews while I say this, and I can't avoid, it's approaching the throne boldly. Learning, to come to God through what is said in the words that are written. But a good starting point would be to read the whole gospel through 2 or 3 times, even though I've read it dozens of times myself. The first thing I did when I started to do this was pick up my Greek New Testament and read the gospel through entirely, start to finish. I'll probably be doing that more times before we're done, but I'll also read the material from the chapters of the book. I encourage you to get the book. I realize I'm a publisher and that's salesmanship, but at the same time, this book had such a profound impact on me. As we go through the chapters, we're going to be studying things like healing prayer. We're going to be studying sacraments and the call to ministry of all the believers. Dr. Weiss has a very different view. Some people consider John very sacramental in its theology, and he sees it much differently in the ministry of all believers, in opening up this kind of thing to everyone. So we're going to study that kind of material. We're going to be talking about the death of Christ as it's portrayed in the resurrection. And so if you pick up the book and at least read the passages that we have. And I'd recommend also, after what I've said about the introduction, I haven't read all of either what Dr. Black or Dr. Weiss said, and I also read Leon Morris's introduction in his commentary in the New International Commentary on the New Testament, and just for reference, a number of introductions in study Bibles. Pick up a couple of different introductions. Strongly preferably, pick up a couple of introductions that come from a different perspective. As an example, we have the New International Study Bible. That gives you a fairly theological, theme-oriented introduction from a mainline Protestant kind of perspective. I have the NLT Study Bible. It's an excellent evangelical study Bible. From a broader, even secular perspective, the Oxford Study Bible based on the Revised English Bible. I happen to love the translation for its literary value, even though I question some of their decisions, but then who doesn't question some decisions in various translations? But also that introduction is going to be more technical. You can find a number of these online or in bookstores. So read a couple of introductions and read those first 18 verses of the gospel according to John. And so next week, it'll be Thursday night, 7 p.m. Central Time, 8 p.m. Eastern, and we'll start in doing the exercises in biblical theology. Now, what I've been doing tonight is I have it as part of the participatory Bible study method that I teach. I wrote a book co-authored with Jeffrey Lentz, who's a United Methodist pastor, titled Learning and Living Scripture. And we put as our last but not least item on the method of Bible study is sharing. Sharing doesn't involve you pinning everybody down and saying, hey, listen to me, what I know. Sharing involves hearing from other people and also potentially being corrected by other people. Don't get into a world by yourself in Bible study. Share with others. So what I invite you to do is both respond to me, tell me, what works for you, what doesn't, and I'll, ask your questions, make your comments, and we'll make this into a discussion. And as you study, do the same thing with your friends, with people in your church congregation. Sharing is so important because we each come at this from a different perspective. Remember what I said about the two stories. We're always telling more than one story when we share what we have studied, because there's the story of what God did in history. Most of your scripture comes from people perceiving that God had acted in history and then trying to respond to that. But then when I look at that and I respond to it, it's the story of the impact of that on my life. So that's something that is worth sharing both ways. That's why I'm not at all worried about that connection, that two horizons. If we're looking at the story of Jesus, the story of John's community, what I hope is that that's going to extend from the story of John's community and their testimony into the story of our individual lives. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sticking around. And I look forward to going through these exercises in biblical theology with Dr. Weiss and all of the other material that I can bring to bear each Thursday evening.